Hello. Guys, these morning Facebook Lives are a new thing I'm experimenting with, and I'm not sure that I love it yet, but we're going to just giving it a go. I have a feeling it won't be a great time for most people to show up. I'm just going to wait for people to come on. I could talk about nonsense while I wait. I don't know if anyone will come on. I'll talk about the shirt I'm wearing. It says Space Holder Birth Keeper, and it has this like starburst sign on it. It's a shirt I designed. It's in my Etsy store. It felt like an appropriate one to wear today because we're going to be talking about free birth, and birth keepers fit in with that, in my opinion. So it's Friday morning here. I'm in Michigan. For those of you who don't know, I live in Grand Rapids area, Michigan, kind of on the periphery of the city, on an acre and a half, an old farmhouse with woods all around us, behind us mostly. And it's snowing here. It's one of those beautiful snows that sticks to the branches. I'm loving it. My husband made me a fire in the wood stove out here in the garage. I have my mocha, my mug that says blessed from one of my client friends whose free birth I attended this year. So those are some things to be grateful for. That's the scene, setting the scene for you this morning. Hi, Britt. It's good to see you. All right. So just because I don't know how many people are going to log on, I'm just going to start. And I have some notes I'm going to reference today. So today we're talking about to free birth or not to free birth. And once I started writing my notes for doing this live, I realized that I have a lot of thoughts on this subject. So this might end up being kind of long. But hopefully that's okay with you. And if you have to get off at any point, you can always come back and finish watching the replay later. So, and just if you didn't already know this, I always save the replays of these into the guide section in this group. And I also upload it to my YouTube channel. So if you look for Sister Birth on YouTube, you'll find video replays of all of these little chats that I've done. Okay, so to free birth or not to free birth, I want to start by saying I feel like I'm a little bit unique in the sense that, as the name of the Facebook group I lead even indicates, assisted or unassisted, I am very supportive of both. And I am not dogmatic about this. This isn't a subject where I'm like preaching home birth or preaching unassisted birth or preaching always use a midwife, which I think is kind of unusual in the natural birth community. It seems like usually people are on one or the other. Hi, Janny. They're either like for instance, Free Birth Society that I followed for a long time until some of the spiritual influences started getting to be too much for me. So I have backed off from that, but they're like free birth, like unassisted birth, buck even the midwives. And that's kind of their stance. And then in other home birth groups, like even Happy Home Birth Academy, which I actually really love, the Happy Home Birth podcast, she's very much like, yeah, midwives are best, like she doesn't hate on the people who free birth, but she's clearly pro midwife. And I personally see merit to both. And I really, really firmly believe that women are able to make good choices for themselves about this, and that there are beautiful options available in both realms. And that it is not the position of me or any other person to tell them which route they should take, but rather to help them ask the questions that get them closer to the answer that's best for them and closer to being able to hear what the Holy Spirit might be guiding them personally to do. The Holy Spirit is our counselor, our advisor, the one who leads us into truth. And I really trust that. So everything I say today, just know that that's my heart. My heart would be that you would continually go back to the Holy Spirit who dwells in you and seek guidance in that space and trust that your good Father is able to lead you into the path that he has for you for this birth. And where he leads you for this birth might be different than where he's led you for births in the past, which might be different from where he leads you for births in the future. Like when it comes to our children, for instance, this is a sidetrack, but we currently homeschool our kids. We actually unschool them. But my husband and I decided early on that we would take it 1 year at a time, one kid at a time. And what that does, having that stance, opens us up to being able to pivot and to change track as we are led by God. So as long as this is working and unschooling works for us and for all of our children, then that's what we're going to keep doing. But if we get the sense that one of our children actually really would do well in school and maybe really wants to go to school, then we're able to pivot and say, then this year for this kid, let's let them try school. Or, oh, this kid might need more structure than unschooling. This year for this kid, let's get them some curriculum. So I take it that way with birth too. One birth at a time, right? And with each birth, we revisit our decisions and priorities and values and what fits for us in that season. And I think that has to be true when we're choosing whether or not to free birth or have a midwife. Now, clearly you've noticed I don't champion hospital births basically ever. I don't, honestly, if I'm totally honest, I don't see that as an equally valid choice in most situations. There are definitely times where it is unavoidable in true medical emergencies, and I 100% get that. And I will never say not. I'm not like ride or die with a home birth, like if death is can be avoided because by just going to the hospital, then go to the hospital. Okay, so what unassisted birth or free birth, and those are two terms that are mostly used interchangeably. What that and home birth with midwife have in common is quite a lot. Like the commonalities are vast. They both share the perspective that birth is a normal physiological event that works well the vast majority of the time, right? And they both share the perspective that the woman should be centered in her care, and that it centers around her and her needs and her preferences as an individual, instead of care in the obstetric model. It really centers and circles around the policies, protocols, and preferences of the medical professionals that are taking care of you. So it is not woman-centered. So, and obviously both unassisted birth and midwife-assisted birth happen at home, outside of hospitals, because it is not seen as a medical event. So there's a lot in common there. However, a midwife is not a midwife, right? There are, within the realm of midwifery, there are many types of midwives, both different types, like which letters they have after their name. So there's professional certified midwives, which are certified professional midwives, CPMs. There's CNMs, certified nurse midwives. There's licensed midwives. There's certified midwives. There's direct entry midwives. And there's traditional midwives. So when we say we're going to have a midwife at home, we might mean any one of those things. And then not only that, but even within each of those letters behind the name, there's different personalities, and every midwife is a human being with her own background, her own belief systems, her own guiding philosophies, her own preferences about how she runs her practices, and her own levels of comfort about what she will and will not do. So even if one midwife is able to attend a breech delivery at home according to the law of the land and the limits of her license, she may still choose not to because she just doesn't feel confident or comfortable doing that, right? Whereas alternatively, you might find somebody who is not legally allowed to do breech births, or her licensure doesn't allow her to do breech births, but she personally feels very adequate in doing that and strongly believes that women should be able to have their babies breech at home. And so she might be willing to, oh, oops, I didn't realize the baby was breech until it was too late, right? So when we're looking for a midwife, we're not just looking for which letters they have to after their name, but like what do they really believe? What guides them? How do they operate? And that's why we have to interview them so carefully. Okay, what was in my train of thought here? And choosing a midwife makes a lot of sense in a lot of instances. Like, if you desire to just feel cared for and to have that like almost maternal like presence, well, I always like the midwives who are older and have had their own children, and their children are like more like older than mine or grown even. I like that maternal feeling, honestly, when it's available. Just having that kind of motherly thing that can be really great. Or if you desire to honestly just be able to outsource the mental load of having to think about every different scenario that could happen and what you would do in that scenario, and you just want to be able to relax into your labor and birth process and let it unfold, knowing that there's somebody there whose hands are trained and whose mind is fully up to date on everything that they need to know, who's watching over you. If that just sounds good to you, then a midwife is great to have. Like, they allow us the luxury in a different way of kind of just like melting into our labor process without also having to be vigilant, right? And there's no shame in that. That can be really beautiful. And that's one of the biggest reasons to hire midwives is for if something were to go wrong, they're there. Also, having a midwife can be great if you just lack confidence and are somebody who tends to like receiving direction from somebody outside of yourself, who can just kind of say, hey, maybe you want to try this now. Let's get you into this position. Now you need to go for a walk. Like, if you like a little bit of directiveness, and finding a midwife who's willing to give that feels really good for some women's personalities or where they are in their life. And also, I will say this. Historically, midwifery is the oldest profession, probably arguably in history of mankind. Midwifery has been around from the very beginning. Like, we have in scripture, we have evidence of them in the book of Exodus, where they were ordered by the Pharaoh to kill all the Hebrew babies upon birth. And there's 2 midwives mentioned. I don't even know how to pronounce their names, but they disobeyed the Pharaoh and obeyed God instead, and they refused to kill the baby boys, and they lied about it. And they said, oh, those Hebrew women, they just have their babies before we can get there, so we don't have a chance to kill them. It's such a sick order, isn't it? So we know that God's people were using midwives as far back as Exodus, probably longer. Of course, Eve probably didn't have a midwife because she was the only one. And so I like to think of God being her midwife. And I think he still offers to be that for us in many ways. I have even heard, you guys, that it is highly likely that Mary, like the mother of Jesus, was attended by midwives too. So that when she went to Bethlehem and found no room in the inn, first of all, the word inn does not mean what we think it means. It was not like a hotel. It would have been an extra spare room in somebody's family home. She couldn't find a place, but so where she did end up, it would have been traditionally, like, her husband was known in that area. So they knew people. They weren't strangers there. And it would have been culturally the norm for the community midwives, the traditional midwives in that area, to come attend any woman who was in labor and birth. So it is very possible and even likely that whoever the midwives were in that area would have come and tended to Mary. So I sometimes hear people use, well, Mary had an unassisted birth as an argument to have an unassisted birth. And I'm just saying, I don't know if that's true. It might not be true. It might be that she did have midwives. But of course, what a midwife was then is very different than what a midwife is now, right? They were traditional midwives. They didn't go through 4-year plus training degree programs. They didn't go through apprenticeship where they had to check off certain boxes and learn how to suture and how to administer Pitocin and put in IVs and all of that, obviously, right? They would have just been taken under the wing of a midwife who was older than them, who saw a gift in them and affirmed it and trained them up and let them follow them around and become who they were. They would have been almost like a disciple to the midwife. That's how midwives were made until relatively recent history. And this is where it gets weird, is that as midwifery has made a resurgence, there's so much midwifery history I could get into here, but I'm skimming. There's fear around it. There always has been fear. I mean, we used to burn midwives at the stake and call them witches. Not we, but like historically, that's what happened. So as midwifery made a comeback in the 70s around the Ina May Gaskin time, where it kind of started to like creep back in after a long period of relative silence and disuse, along came it with this impulse by the powers that be to control and regulate and dictate what that can look like, and to integrate it as much as possible into the ideals and mindsets of a medical model. And so right now what we have is I think more than half of the states in the United States are now licensing midwifery, which sounds good, but it's a mixed bag. Licensing makes it legal if you meet certain criteria, but those criteria are often going to a certain kind of accredited school, checking certain boxes, and agreeing to certain limitations to what you can and cannot do. For instance, and this varies by state, so I don't know what it is in your state. And my state actually is pretty they only started licensure a couple of years ago, and our rules are pretty good. Like midwives here can still attend women with like, I think they can still do twins and breeches here, for instance, whereas in some states they can't. And in many states they'll say if your client goes to 42 weeks, you have to transfer her care to the hospital. Or if she has this particular health concern or complication or whatever, then you can't serve her. So it kind of just says, this is what you can and can't do. This is where you are no longer allowed to serve. And it puts women in a position where they have to abide by these rules that they may or may not actually agree with. And they may even have to be told they have to administer certain tests and measurements, and that they have to carry pharmaceutical drugs like Pitocin, and that they have to know how to do IVs at home. So this medical influence is creeping into what has been a traditional, completely independent of the medical system, woman-centered, wise woman way of helping women have babies. So the whole flavor of midwifery in the United States is shifting right now in some really significant ways. And you're probably even noticing it in some of the birth groups. You'll notice people using this term midwives, right? Medical instead of, medical wives, like that, the flavor is seeping in. It is. And so I think we are growing aware, and this is kind of big picture, we are growing aware of the fact that the medical system is not kind to mothers and babies, and it's failing. Like the hospitals in the United States, which most babies in the United States are born in hospitals, and we have some of the worst maternal and infant outcomes in the world. There are like tiny countries in Africa that do better than us. Many countries where midwifery is more common have better outcomes than we do. So we're realizing this. So women are saying, I don't want to be in that system anymore. And especially with COVID now, right? Like, get me out of that system. It doesn't make sense for me anymore. I don't feel safe there. I don't trust it. If you're Black, it's even worse. 30 to 40% worse outcomes for Black women in the United States than for white women. So they're saying, let's get out of here. And then at the same time, midwifery is becoming more medicalized. And so now I think we're seeing women are like, ooh, I don't want that either. Because we're distancing from the idea that birth is a medical event. And at the same time, we're making midwifery more medicalized, right? And I think this is why we're seeing a huge increase in the interest in free birth. Combined with, like Britt's just saying, COVID. So I have so many women joining this group every day who are like, I think I might want an unassisted birth. I'm here to learn more. Like, record numbers of women suddenly wanting to know what it would be like to have an unassisted birth. Okay. That's the end of my notes, but I have so much more to say. Okay. So how do you know if having an unassisted birth is a good choice for you? There's so many things that go into this. Obviously, one would be if where you live, there are not midwives, and that leaves you therefore with a choice between an unassisted home birth or going to the hospital. I think this one comes up a lot because there are definitely underserved pockets in the United States where there just are not midwives. And there's also states where midwifery is illegal. Having a midwife attend a home birth is illegal in certain states. I actually was just talking to a mama this week who lives in Nebraska, and Nebraska is incredibly hostile towards midwifery. So finding a midwife who's willing to risk her neck is really hard. Really hard. So, because you'd have to be doing it illegally underground, right? So then it leaves you with that. Either have to go to the hospital or have to have an unassisted birth. If you're in that position, raise your hand. I would love to know. And this is not ideal. This is not ideal because in my ideal world, women would be choosing free birth, not because they feel like backed into a corner, but because they feel ready and excited to take on the responsibility and privileges of birthing their baby completely on their own. That would be ideal. But there are definitely women who are choosing it because they don't see another way that they can live with. It's like the lesser of two evils for them. And that's a bummer. And it's a little scary too, because then they're put in this position where they're scrambling to try to figure out how to do it. And they're maybe not actually very prepared. And so that's it can be dangerous, right? Choosing free birth requires a great deal of responsibility and a willingness to deeply learn and take radical ownership of every aspect of your and your baby's care. And not everyone is naturally up for that challenge or just doesn't want to do it. And that's okay. That's okay. But some women are being forced to do it. So, okay, here's a funny analogy. I was recently exposed to people who have COVID indoors for a few hours. And then 2 days later, I found out that they tested positive for COVID. So we have been quarantining this week, trying to see if we also have COVID, and just trying to stay away from people in case we do. And I just got my test results back yesterday. I'm negative. But while I was sitting there waiting to find out if I had COVID, I was thinking to myself, oh, I kind of want it. And the reason I said that is because I have been studying for this exam and preparing for this event for over a year. Like, to me, like, it feels amazingly powerful to be able to find and utilize information and resources and supplements and protocols that I can implement in the event that myself or my family become ill. So I've been putting in work. I have stuff stocked, right? I have the nebulizer and like stuff to put in the nebulizer. I have the vitamins and the teas and the white pine and all the things, the dandelion root tea. I was like, I'm ready for the test. Like, I've been studying. Give me the test. I can do this. It sounds so weird. And I was like, I just want to do this. And then I can have it over with. And then I have my antibodies. Like, let's do the thing. So I feel like when we're choosing home birth, that's also why I chose home birth or free birth, with my last baby, is because I had been studying for the exam. I had been preparing for the event. I had been apprenticing with a midwife. I had been reading midwifery textbooks and reading midwifery memoirs and just learning all the things and gathering all the tools, the herbs and the blood pressure cuff and the urine test strips. Like, I had the stuff and I was ready for the exam. I was like, yeah, let's do it. I got this. And to me, that's a beautiful, a joyful place from which to choose unassisted birth, and where I would ideally want people to be coming from. Because it is powerful, sisters. It is amazingly liberating and amazingly empowering to take on the responsibility, own it, and do it. And so if that's attractive to you, having that experience and being changed and transformed and stretched in that way, then free birth is a great choice. So, okay, other things to consider when you're trying to choose whether or not to have an unassisted home birth. Obviously, whatever health conditions you may or may not have, that may or may not add layers of difficulty or complication to the outcomes of your birth. Things like gestational diabetes, which can be argued whether or not that's even a real thing by some. Preeclampsia, if you have or emergency kind of stuff. If you have a incision from a previous C-section, that is the T-scar. There's all these different things that genuinely do make someone a bit more high risk. Having twins, that's just a little more complicated. It's not quite as straightforward. A breech baby. These are things that might give you pause. Okay, that's another level of stuff that I have to be willing to take on the risk and responsibility for. And you have to ask yourself the questions about each one of those things as they come up. Okay, now that I know that I have gestational diabetes, am I still willing to take on the risk and responsibility of that? Now that I know I have cholestasis, am I still willing to take on the risk and responsibility of that? Or is it time for me to call in some help? And there isn't shame in calling in for some help. We just have to keep in touch with ourselves, keep checking in with ourselves and with the Holy Spirit each step of the way. Because to me, an unassisted birth doesn't mean that you commit to having your baby at home with no medical professionals present, no matter what. To me, it just means that you are seating yourself in the position of authority over what happens in your birth process. And that might end up meaning that at some junctures, you seek some degree of help from medical professionals or midwives. But what makes it a free birth, in my opinion, is the mental state you're in, the posture you're taking toward the whole experience. And that also is, I think, a difference from some of the hardcore free birth communities out there, is that they're kind of like, you do it at home or die, like, I mean, like, even if you die trying. And I'm not quite that extreme about it. I think that free birth is about liberating women to trust their intuition and the Holy Spirit in them, to direct each aspect of their care. And sometimes that will mean using medical assistance and options. But with you in the driver's seat, you are dipping in and out of the system according to your own desires and directives, taking what you need and coming back out, which is entirely different than just getting on the conveyor belt of the medical system and riding it, right? Okay. So we talked about proximity and availability of midwives. We've talked about just feeling ready for the challenge. We've talked about, what was the last thing I said? Oh, thinking about different like health concerns that you might personally have and need to consider. What else? Thinking about what support you have, I think, is also a big part of choosing free birth. I also don't believe that free birth has to mean alone birth. It doesn't have to mean that you are literally alone. You are allowed to still want and desire feminine presence at your birth. I think that feminine presence and the space holding of someone who trusts God and trusts birth is incredibly powerful and good. I think it's good. I know that there's some free birthers who feel led to just literally have it just be them and their husband, and that's it. I personally wanted the feminine presence of one or two other women in my life. And so neither of them are midwives. One is a doula photographer friend, and the other is a fellow, like, I met her through Indie Birth actually years ago. She free birthed her own babies in community. And her presence and her prayerfulness and her wisdom and the way that she sees birth and holds it and trusts it, it just felt good to have her presence. I just wanted her there. I didn't expect her to do anything for me. In fact, if she did, I probably would have been mad, and she knew that. I didn't want her to do anything. I didn't have an expectation for her to save me. I didn't expect her to handle any emergencies that might come up. But just her presence, her prayerful, space-holding presence felt really good to me. And I think we're wired for that, women. Like, I've talked about this before. We're wired for community. Like the Israelite community, God's people, it was not an individualistic society. It was a communal society. And so free birthing in community, I think, can be a lovely thing. And that means looking around you at the women who are already present in your community, and you're not looking for their credentials on paper or what letters they have after their name. You're just looking for who can hold this space for me, who can sit with me and intercede. And it might be that it is just your husband. That's okay too. But consider what support you have around you as you venture into these waters of unassisted birth. Somebody who can trust you and trust the process. You also need to know yourself when you're thinking about choosing an unassisted birth. So I noticed over the course of my first 4 births, which were all attended by a pretty hands-off midwife, mostly hands-off, low intervention kind of midwife, that I liked to be alone, that I don't like to be touched, that I was not looking for direction most of the time. I mean, there was a couple of times when she would give me very carefully chosen minimal direction, and I did appreciate it. But I was like, I actually like having this be a pretty independent experience is something I like naturally, tend to gravitate towards. I don't want a party birth. I like minimal number of people in my space. In fact, I never hired a doula those first 4 births because I already had the midwife and her assistants and then my photographer and my husband, and I felt like enough. Like I was like, I don't want to add another body. So if you're somebody who tends to function best in birth when you are able to be inward and you don't want a lot of extra people around and you're very confident in just getting in the zone and doing your thing without a lot of external inputs, then free birth might be a really good choice for you. You might function really, really well in that setting. Like if at your last birth you had a midwife and you found yourself annoyed by her talking or by her touches, then free birth might be something that feels really good to you, and you will do better in that situation. You won't get thrown off. So that's another thing to consider. Somebody's saying that they like their party births, and that's okay. Good on ya. If you can function well and have a baby in a party setting, I admire that. It's just not me. So yeah, again, know yourself, right? Know yourself. Know your current life circumstances. There's always like money to consider. There is your husband's sense about things to consider. Obviously, when we're married, we want to move in unity with our partners as much as possible. And though I don't think that husbands are right to forbid their wives from having a home birth or an unassisted birth, I don't think that's appropriate, frankly, for them to do that. But I do think it is appropriate for us to pause and listen deeply to whatever concerns our husbands might have, and to have conversations about those things, and to do our best to work our way through to a place of unity, so that he is willing to be supportive. And sometimes God uses our husbands to slow us down or to caution us in ways that, if we're humble enough to hear, we need to hear, right? They might keep us from plowing forward into something that isn't ultimately going to be good for us. So it's important that we give them space and that we are humbly willing to hear them. What else to consider? I'm just considering unassisted birth. Your distance from the hospital might be a factor to consider. I live very close to really good hospitals, so I knew that if I needed it, I could get there quickly and receive decent care. Some people are having unassisted births because they live in the middle of the boonies. And that may be both the reason to have an unassisted birth, because you can't get to a hospital fast enough, but it also might be a reason to pause and say, if I needed help, I can't get it quickly. Am I okay with that, right? It's also good to consider how much energy and time are you willing to put into studying and learning about what you would do in emergency situations. Are you able to get kind of the tinctures and tools that you need? Those are things to consider. I wanted to say this too. A while back, I listened to a podcast by Marin at Indie Birth. Indie Birth was also a really big influence on me for a long time, until I became very uncomfortable with spiritual elements of their stuff too. So I've also distanced from them and their stuff in the recent years. But Marin was talking about the free birth thing, and she's more like pro traditional midwifery, and not really. She thinks that people only choose free birth because of trauma and fear, and I don't think that's true, but that's her position. But anyway, one thing she was saying in this podcast that I did think was worth mentioning was that there's kind of 2 different approaches that you can take to free birth, and both have a place. One is, and some people will gravitate towards this model, this would be the like become your own midwife kind of thing, where you're going to learn what a lot of things that midwives know. You're going to read the midwifery textbooks. You're probably going to be testing your own urine and your own blood pressure and measuring things, and maybe even checking your blood glucose. And you're going to make sure that you have diligently studied complications and come up with a plan of what you're going to do in case of each of those complications. And you kind of put on the midwife mantle and you wear it into your unassisted birth. You have a plan, you're prepared, you've been really systematic about your preparation. And then in the other camp would be the camp that's just like, I'm not even going to pretend to be a midwife. I'm not even going to try to put on the midwife mantle. I'm not here to do all the studying and to try to know all the things or think that I can know all the things. And these types of people are going to approach a free birth more as like, it's literally just like pooping. Like I don't have to study to poop. I'll figure it out as I go. I'm going to trust my instincts. I'm going to trust that whatever happens is meant to happen. And that might include if death happens, then that's meant to happen. And so it's a very more like relaxed, radical trust kind of way to approach free birth, where you don't fill your head with stuff. You just go into it and let it happen and let it be what it's going to be. So I don't know which one you would be. That's something to consider too. And I think there's pros and cons to both. I don't think that one or the other is the better one. So as you can see, I'm not here today to give anybody firm answers about everything or firm direction about anything, but I'm just here to try to prime the pump of helping you ask the questions and think through all the various elements as you're discerning your way forward. And then ultimately, I'll leave us with this thought. I am a fan of what I call listening. Well, I didn't make this term up. Listening prayer. That when we pray, we're not just there to talk to God, but we're also meant to listen and posture ourselves to hear God. And so I think, especially with this decision, well, with all big decisions, we go before Him and we say, this is what I'm thinking. These are my desires on the subject. These are my fears on the subject. And we just lay that all out before God. And then we say, I want to hear you. I want to hear what you have to say about this, because it matters to me that I'm in your will more than it matters to me that I do what I think I want to do. And we kind of surrender our desires, surrender our ideas, our preconceived ideas of what's the best thing to do. And we invite Him to speak. And now how He speaks can vary a lot. I think it varies by person, by season. It might be that you'll actually hear a still small voice in that moment of quietness saying something to you that's meaningful and directly applies to your question. Or it might be that you'll have a dream or a couple dreams in the coming days. Or it might be that suddenly a certain resource or topic will keep popping up everywhere that you look, like left and right. You're like, oh, wow. Oh, that's a theme coming up. Maybe God's trying to speak to me through that. Or He'll lead you to a person who's meant to play a specific role. Or He'll give somebody else sometimes a prophetic word for you or word of knowledge for you. Or sometimes it's as simple as St. Ignatius talked about consolation and desolation. And I love this. And I use this a lot in my own life, and our family does. When you sit with the idea of having a free birth, do you experience a sense of consolation or a sense of desolation? Consolation means, according to Ignatius, kind of like this quieting in our spirit, an expansive openness, a weightlessness, like a joyful lifting of concern, peace, that peace that passes understanding. It's this consolation. Whereas desolation is a state where we're still questioning, frantically questioning, searching, restless. We might feel heavy or dark or just uneasy. And St. Ignatius taught that was a large way that God speaks, is through a sense of consolation or desolation. And the goal obviously would be that before you move forward with a free birth, that you would have a sense of consolation and not desolation, right? So the Lord is your good shepherd, and He will lead you into the right path for you. I said I was going to talk about my own story of choosing free birth, and I guess I kind of did, but I sort of mixed it in with the rest of this talk. I can tell that in a more cohesive story, if you want to hang out longer for that. Yeah, I think so. It's pretty short though. Okay, I'll just tell it for anyone who's still hanging out, and you don't have to listen to this if you don't want to. But so for those of you who don't know, my first 4 babies were born at home with the same midwife, who was, at the time I met her, a direct entry midwife, not licensed. There wasn't licensure in my state, to be fair, so she couldn't have been. Don't think she was even certified at that time. So she was a pretty traditional midwife, pretty hands-off, didn't really do much of the kind of normal lab tests. No, we didn't do blood work. We didn't do GBS swabs. We didn't do gestational diabetes monitoring. But she would just talk to me about nutrition and eating well, and she'd listen to my baby and measure my fundal height. And so I used her for my first 4 births. And over that time, she became certified, and then she became licensed. And so things started to shift a little bit, but I still declined most of the new things that she started offering, like lab work and stuff. And I also became her apprentice for a bit. when my fourth child was 4 months old through a year and some old. So I worked with her as a student midwife for a bit. And it was in that same window of time that I learned about indie birth and was listening to the indie birth podcast a lot. Taking Back Birth is the name of it. And I was like going through all the archives of the podcast and listening and just having my mind blown because previous to that, I had been obsessed with midwifery memoirs, and I loved reading midwife memoirs. And the midwife memoirs I was reading were older, like quite a bit older. So they were mostly all written by traditional midwives, right? So then here I am in my apprenticeship learning about the impending licensure stuff in Michigan, learning about certification and regulation, and like having to learn how to do some things that were more medical, like lab work and IVs and such and such, and carrying Pitocin and how to administer Pitocin. And I was like, this isn't really what I signed up for. Like when I was reading these midwife memoirs, I wasn't picturing this medical stuff. I was picturing like herbs and trust and like natural remedies, and not this medical stuff. Like this isn't what I want. So then Indie Birth podcast was aligned with that. It was like, yeah, no, traditional midwifery is where it's at. Like we need to opt out of licensure. And then somehow through them, I also learned about free birth. I don't remember why, because they don't really even champion it, but I think they do champion like really letting women be free to birth in their own way without interference. And then I started reading more about free birth. And the more I read about it, the more I was like, oh, I love this. Like, I really love this. And oh no, I learned about it before my fourth was born. That's right. Because when my fourth born's birth was coming up, I remember thinking I kind of wanted to do it alone. Like whenever I pictured her birth, I pictured myself alone in a dark bathroom. But I had already hired my midwife and her assistants and a photographer and somebody to come be with my kids. And I had like this slew of people coming, and I loved them all. Like I really liked these people and I didn't want to fire them. And I was like, but I keep seeing myself alone. And what ended up happening with that birth was that I gave birth in a blizzard, and it was like the labor was so manageable for so long that I didn't think it was real. And then I told my midwife maybe it was real, but then it stopped. So then I went to bed and told her not to come. And then almost as soon as I got in bed, I was like, oh my word, I'm going to have a baby right now. So then I called her back and she headed over, and I didn't call the rest of my team because I thought she would tell them, or she did tell them. But anyway, all that to say, no one was there until like literally minutes before my daughter came out. My midwife walked in and helped my husband catch her. But the rest of the people came in after she was born. So it ended up being kind of a neat blend of an unassisted birth, but also having my whole team of people there. They all trickled in after the fact and hung out with me during the first 2 or 3 hours after birth, and tucked me in and cleaned me up and helped me deliver my placenta and took pictures and whatever. So I remember kind of wanting an unassisted birth with my fourth, and growing in my appreciation of traditional midwifery and of unassisted birth during my apprenticeship. And then I quit my apprenticeship partly because of that misalignment between the philosophies of midwifery care. But I thought I was done having babies. My husband and I were like, we're not having any more kids. So I actually was genuinely kind of bummed out, because I was like, oh shoot, that means that I can't have an unassisted birth. Like I really wanted to be able to try that, but if I'm not going to have any more babies, I can't do that. And then I like, obviously I can't make another human just so I can have an unassisted birth. Like that's irresponsible. So fast forward a few years, and we unexpectedly found out we were pregnant. And after the initial shock and the nervousness about telling my husband, one of my first thoughts was, I could have a free birth now. So again, it was very joyfully chosen. I am not in a midwife desert over here. In fact, Grand Rapids, Michigan has a lot of really good midwives. Like we are well stocked in quality midwives. So it wasn't that I couldn't find someone at all. It wasn't even that I didn't like them. Like I do, and I've worked with many of them as a doula and a birth photographer. I've shared birth spaces with most of the midwives in my area, and really appreciate them. But I just wanted and felt ready to do it on my own the fifth time. And even to take on my own prenatal care felt really welcome and joyful. There was just a natural pull towards it. And my conviction that birth works best when it's interfered with and monitored least had grown so much over my years of study that I just wanted to minimize monitoring and testing in fact, not have any of it, and just practice radical trust in birth and the God who made it. And I don't have regrets about that. If you've been here a while, you might know that when that fifth baby was born, she was born limp and white, and her APGAR score was probably 1 or 2 out of a scale of 1 to 10, guys. And I had to give her breath. And that was intense. And yet I did it, right? My mother instinct combined with my learning kicked in, and I was able to do what needed doing for her. And we did call EMS, but by the time they arrived in our driveway, she was crying. So I turned them away. My husband turned them away and told them to leave. They didn't even come in the house. So I still don't have regrets. And it did work. And my instinct was trustworthy. Now, was it painful and hard to sit with the reality of the fact that I could have lost my daughter? Heck yes, it was. Of course it was. But even then, the quietness and stillness and complete love that she was welcomed into, if her life had been short, that would have been the way I'd want her to go, right? Which sounds, it's a heavy thing to say. But so anyway, I chose it just because I was ready and excited about it. And to be, in the interest of completely full disclosure, my husband did still have some worries about it. So we ended up doing 3 like a la carte prenatals with one of the midwives in our area who's been around. She's been delivering babies for 40 years. And we hired her for just a la carte prenatals where we would just go in mostly to talk through emergency preparedness, because he really had some questions about that he needed someone other than me to address for him. So like we talked a lot about postpartum hemorrhage with her. And she would just kind of try to reassure him. She would like listen to the baby and palpate my belly a little bit. And she also like helped me she wrote vitamin recommendations for me so that I could get Samaritan's Ministries to reimburse my vitamins. But she was very, very supportive. And she's like, yeah, Brooke, you're ready for this. Like you can do an unassisted birth. And then she also ended up being able to come by after the baby was born to do a kind of abbreviated newborn exam and just check in with us. And then she filled out our paperwork for the county clerk's office. She did the live birth certificate or certificate of live birth paperwork for us. We hired her to do that too. So it was nice to have that kind of in-between option where she wasn't at the actual birth, but she was still kind of in the wings. And she always also let me know that if I changed my mind and did want her to come to my actual birth, that she would do that. And I think she did that partly because I already had a relationship with her prior to being pregnant. She had been kind of a mentor to me in my midwifery studies a little bit, and I had worked many births with her. And so we were already very familiar, and there was high trust level. So she knew that she could trust me to let her fill this role in her life without it being a liability to her, if that makes sense. So that was really nice that I had that option. So, and then, like I said, my free birth was not an alone birth. It included the presence of, well, actually it did end up being alone because they didn't make it in time, but I had planned to have my doula photographer friend and this other friend of mine, who I would call a birth keeper, be present. But they didn't come till after the baby was out and breathing. So they were not there even during the resuscitation that I did. The only other person who was there besides my immediate family was a family friend of ours who is like an honorary member of our family. And she was there to be on point with our kids. So she was present too. So that's the story there. All right. Well, I've jabbered on. This is probably one of the longest lives I've done. So thank you for listening if you're still here. And I'd be curious to see your comments about some of your thought processes about choosing unassisted birth. If you have anything to add to how you are making that decision or have made that decision in the past and what factors you've considered, feel free to leave those in the comments. I'd be really interested to read them. And let's keep this conversation going inside of our Facebook group. These are good things to talk about. And I just want you to know I support you. And I believe that you, with the Holy Spirit dwelling in you, are fully capable of making the right, beautiful, life-giving, empowering choices for you and your family, whether that's with a midwife or without a midwife. All right. Bless you, sisters. Bye.